Thank you very much for this opportunity. First of all, I would like to emphasize that what I'm going to present is still a very much work in progress. So I really appreciate the possibility to present our platform in front of such an expert audience, and I'm really looking forward to your feedback and your questions. And so first of all, I will a little bit continue and elaborate on what Victoria said, because as she already mentioned, these projects are partially overlapping, but also I'll show you what we can do on the platform that we've created. And first of all, just a couple of words about this platform, about this project. So this is, we can say that this is an umbrella project that unites more than 20 historians, sociologists, anthropologists, economists, literary critics, and other scholars of various backgrounds. On the map you can also see the geographical representation of institutions and scholars that are involved in this project. And some of the scholars are also in this room. So, for example, Natalia Tryshenko and Irina Sklokina were also involved in this project since its beginning. And so the main focus, the main idea is to propose the transcultural and interdisciplinary approach to the question of regionalism in Ukraine, and it can be roughly divided into two stages. First one was realized between 2012 and 15 and was called Region, Nation and Beyond, Transcultural Reconceptualization of Ukraine, and an ongoing project is focusing already on transcultural contact zones in Ukraine, going beyond the actual political borders. It is coordinated by the University of St.Gallen, the Center for Governance and Culture, and it is financially supported by Swiss National Science Foundation and State Secretariat for Education, Research and Innovation. And Victoria already mentioned a little bit this recurrent problem of the narrative of divided Ukraine that you can encounter in political narratives, but in fact, and this is one of the departing points from which we designed the idea of this project, is the intellectual also discourse of othering, of internal othering and of divided Ukraine. And here you can see two examples. First of all is a very famous book by Mykola Repchuk about two Ukraines. It has been widely debated in academic circles, but also and especially in the light of current conflict, you can see and you can encounter this discourse among public intellectuals. So, for example, here you have the quote by a writer from Ivano-Frankivsk, Taras Prochasko, who is basically claiming that, you know, west and east of Ukraine are totally different, that unity is just a beautiful fairy tale. And this pattern can also be encountered in many journal articles, and this is a kind of cliche that we also wanted to question and to show it in the situation in a much more complex way. And what I wanted also to draw to draw a question, because I think it's common also for historical maps, for sociological map, is like the dark side of mapping, so the abuses of map. This is something we should all be well aware of. As beautiful and fascinating the tool is, it's also very easy to kind of emphasize a certain point by just adding some brighter colors or more contrast colors. And I'm going to show you some examples. So maps actually played a huge role in the visual narration of divided Ukraine. Most often you would encounter the election maps that counterpose east and west voting for different candidates, and interestingly this was presented as a uniquely Ukrainian case very often. However, if you look on, for example, the election maps of Poland or of Great Britain, you can actually encounter it everywhere. But somehow these maps and these visual images were often used to promote the narrative of divided Ukraine. And of course, recently, in the context of a conflict, the maps, and particularly historical maps, are very often used by propaganda. For example, in this case, this is from a Russian website that maps Ukraine according to Russian imperial names, so Malorossia, Novorossia, and Ukraine is just Galicia, and the Subcarpathian Rus is something different. So in this case, you can see how often it can be abused. But also it is the problem with sociological or statistical data, And I wanted to show you two maps that actually present the same question from Ukrainian census of 2001 to support a completely different hypothesis. So the first one comes from an article in Washington Post, which was called 5 Things You Want to Know About Ukraine But Were Always Too Afraid to Ask. And it uses the question about native language from Ukrainian census. And you see that here, according to Oblast, the author mapped the percentage of people for whom the Russian language is native. So the yellow part is less than 20% and the blue part is more than 30%. And of course the image that you see is, Russian speaking East and Ukrainian speaking West. Everything is very simple and clear, and that's how we explain the current conflict. However, the same question was used to map a completely different hypothesis. This is a Ukrainian author, and the green areas are the ones which, according to census, at least 50% of respondents said that their native language is Ukrainian. And the red areas are where 50% at least said that their native language is Russian. And in this case, again, the author uses a language question to explain why particularly these areas were occupied by Russia. So according to this logic, the only explanation of the current conflict is again language. And I think it nicely shows you how, according to just what we decide to map and how, we can support a completely different hypothesis. Not to mention that, the census is actually 17 years old and we are in high demand of more actual data. But that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit later. So Victoria already covered the problem with most sociological surveys, so I'm not going to repeat that. As she said, there is a problem of predefined macro-region because of a too small sample, and that's why one of the main methodological tools in our project was a survey that was conducted in 3 waves, so in 13, 15 and 17, so we are actually now mapping and adding the most recent data, and it is representative on the level of oblast, with the exception in case of 15 and 17 survey of Crimea and non-government controlled areas of Donbass. It has an interdisciplinary focus, so here you can see the areas, the focuses of this survey. These are very diverse, from identity, language to religion, economy, history, memory, and attitudes to current situation. But what was also very important for us to use mixed methods research and also to add qualitative data to our quantitative analysis. So throughout this period of a project, we've conducted over 600 in-depth interviews and focus group discussions. Coming back to the language question, which I presented on the 2 manipulative maps before, I wanted to show you the example from our survey, when we can actually go to the level of oblast. And what is most important here, first of all, you see that it's much more complex than we saw before, but what the census didn't include is bilingual people. So actually people were forced into choosing which language is much more important for them, but as we can see in the eastern and then central part, these yellow areas is the people for whom both languages are native. So the background map, the color map, shows the attitudes to bilingualism in different regions, and we can see that they are actually becoming more and more positive. So only Galicia, only this gray part remains more negative towards the existence of bilingualism in a wider Ukrainian society. And generally, coming a little bit forward, one of the outcomes of our project is the book that is going to be published this year by CEU Press. Hopefully, if nothing happens to the university, we know that nowadays the situation is not so simple. However, it is the name of the book is quite telling in itself. It's called Regionalism Without Region, Reconceptualizing Ukraine's Heterogeneity. And one of the main common conclusions that we came to is that apart from Galicia, there is no clear-cut divide and no clear-cut cultural or memory or language region that we can define. That actually intra-regional differences and complexities are so diverse that we cannot speak about, these very clear-cut divisions. And one more thing before jumping to our website, what I wanted to draw your attention to is the challenges that sociologists encounter while doing research in the time of military conflict. So here on this map you can see the areas that are nowadays practically unavailable to sociological researchers. First of all, there is a question of safety. Both of the interviewers of the team conducting research and the respondents. And we had cases when we still tried to conduct some in-depth interviews in Crimea in 2015, but our interviewer was questioned by FSB, so Social Security Service of Russia, on her way back. And also there were cases when interviewers were actually caught in captivity in Donetsk region, and it took really a long time and a lot of efforts to let them free. So it's very difficult to access this region nowadays. This poses the question of data validity, of course, and the need to redesign the sample completely and to adjust to contemporary situation. There are some exceptions. For example, GFK Ukraine, they've elaborated the technology of computer-assisted telephone interviews, because in NGCAs of Donbass, most of people use one single operator, and this is Vodafone. It's the only one that is available there. And that is why it's possible to call people and conduct telephone interviews. Of course, we don't have the means of controlling these results, but at least this is the way of knowing what is the situation there and trying to reach these people as much as possible. And the non-response level for CATI interviews is much lower than for face-to-face interviews. However, apart from these all methodological problems, there are, of course, ethical and wider societal challenges. What also happens is that sometimes sociologists are accused of pro-Russian or even separatist views. Why? Because in the questionnaire you have to include all kinds of opinions, including the ones that might sound as pro-Russian. For example, if we ask about what is happening in Donbass, one of the options is civil war. And this, of course, it doesn't mean that the sociologist thinks like that, but we need to give the full variety of responses for people to choose. And there were already cases of SBU, so Security Service of Ukraine, interrogating some sociological companies. So nothing happened, they weren't censored or something, but it might lead to self-censorship. So very often sociologists would think twice whether or not to address this problematic or sensitive issues. And of course there are these usual sociological dilemmas of autoethnography, of studying your own society, and is it possible to be detached and objective academically when you are yourself involved in all this emotional, you're involved emotionally in all what's happening. However, it's a wider discussion, so I'm not going to go deeply into details. I just wanted to signalize that these are the problems that we have to bear in mind. And now I would like to present you the platform that we've developed, and where you can have a look on some of the results of our collaborative project. First of all, I would like to say that it's this is the starting page, and it doesn't show. Okay, I don't know why. Should I close the presentation?
Yes.
Probably. Okay. Sorry. Okay. Yeah. Oh. Okay. Now you can see it. Thank you for this remark. So, first of all, it's quite a challenge to manage an interdisciplinary project, but also it's a big challenge to present everything, because you can imagine that when so many scholars have also their individual sub-project, there is a lot going on. First of all, here you can see the network of scholars, so the people who work together. Not everybody is on the website yet, but we are putting new faces online. And of course, one of the main outcomes of our activity are publications. So this is the list of also not all the publications that appeared throughout the project, and it's constantly updated. And also, of course, we organize and participate in a number of conferences. In the About section, you can read more about each of the sub-projects and what are the focuses, who are the scholars involved. So you can see here that the subjects are quite different, from attitudes to corruption in Ukraine to religious attitudes, and also to the question of internally displaced persons as a result of current conflict. So currently it's estimated that there are around 1.5 million people displaced because of what is happening in Crimea and Donbass. And one of the most important targets for us with this platform was to reach different audiences for whom this data could be interesting. So that is why, for example, if you look on the surveys, the methodology is described in details, but also there are several ways in which you can use this survey data. So, for example, you can actually download SPSS databases of 2013 and 15 surveys. You can open it with various softwares, for example, also with R, not only with SPSS. And I think this is particularly useful for social scientists, for those who work with these databases. But also we have just univariate distribution, so percentages and means for each question that you can also explore for your own purposes. And the interactive maps part that Victoria already partly presented, the MAPA project, but I also wanted to show you briefly the previous project that was actually developed before MAPA. It's called Digital Mapping of Historical Regions of Ukraine, and it's based on our survey data. For example, here you have the OpenStreet map as a basis, and you can choose any question from our survey that is interesting for you. Well, let's take, for example, to the question of famine or Holodomor. Let me see where we have. Yeah. So here we have the question whether people agree or disagree that the famine, the Holodomor in Ukraine was a genocide. It was a very topical question and also very much politicized in Ukraine since probably early 2000s. And I will try to show you how the optics will change when we go from macro region to the lowest level. So if we choose the macro-regional map of Ukraine, we will see again this clear-cut east-west divide. So very, very simple, very clear situation. But then if you, for example, go already on oblast level, it becomes much more complex. So if you look, for example, on the south of Ukraine, there is a huge difference between, for example, Odessa Oblast, where 47% believe only that Holodomor was genocide, and Kherson Oblast, where this number is 95%. So that's why it is important also to go to this level. And it becomes even more complicated if we go to the level of rayon. Smaller administrative districts, and also it shows you how the fairly big sample, 6,000 respondents, it also cannot cover entire Ukraine. So of course there will always be some parts where the interviews were not conducted. And it's also interesting that part of our team were exploring this phantom border hypothesis, so how much the historical borders influence contemporary attitudes. You might be skeptical towards this hypothesis or not, but you can also somehow test it with our maps. So, for example, if we speak about Holodomor, it's worth testing whether the borders of interwar period influence the attitudes. So we could assume that in the areas where Holodomor actually happened, so in former Soviet Ukraine, the support to this hypothesis, to the genocide claim is higher. But we will see whether we're right or not. And we are not, because it's actually the highest in the territories of Second Polish Republic, where Holodomor didn't happen. And what is also important, that you can both save the map as a PNG file or export the data to Excel. So for each of the questions that you've mapped, you can actually download this table and remap it in your own way. And apart from interactive maps, we also developed the infographics. Here, for example, you can see it for each of the subsections of the survey. And so let's for example explore the foreign policy attitudes. And another challenges that we encountered, that if we compare the results of 2013 and 15 survey, we have a completely different sample because of the non-government controlled areas, and that's why we had to add one more variable here. It's called 2013 bis, and this is controlled for Crimea and non-government controlled areas of Donbass. Because that's actually was the criticism that we got very often from the audiences to whom we've presented this data. And again, you can download each of these graphs as an Excel file. And we can see that for some questions like the attitudes to joining EU, there is a difference between controlling for occupied Donbass. And for some questions like, for example, attitudes to relations with Russia, there is not really significant differences. So this is also the way to explore how much these regions defined attitudes to certain questions. And one more thing, which is last but not least, is our qualitative data collection. We're still working on making it available for researchers. For now, we are analyzing the interviews in the software called Atlas TI. But this will be also in future available online, of course, after the registration and after signing the proper agreement. And the way that the database should be browsed is via map, so the location of the interviews, collection, education of respondent, and also keyword list. So that's what we are creating right now to enable also intra-collectional search. And this way we hope that our interviews will be available for more researchers. And the most important thing for us, I think, is also to convey together the quantitative and qualitative data. And the way we're trying to do so is by creating story maps. So these are, again, only small examples. If we look at, for example, the story map of Russian identity, so on the background you see the heat map of a question: how strongly do you feel Russian? From 1, not at all, to 5, very strongly. This is the 2013 survey data. You can see this on the legend. And further, if you zoom in, you can look at some quotes from the interviews where people conceptualize what it actually means for them to be Russian. So it's either just a graph in the passport, or it's their family descent. So these conceptualizations are really diverse. This is, for example, from Donetsk. So the really big advantage of our project is that we managed to collect quite a rich data before the crisis and before these regions became unavailable. And of course, this map will be elaborated in future. And I'm also happy to hear your maybe suggestions or criticism. What are the better ways to put together the qualitative and quantitative data? But this is, at least for now, the software and the approach that we took. To conclude, I'd like to say that we are trying to address different audiences, scholars, also policymakers, and I think it's very important. Also, yesterday we talked about the importance to include the IT support team from the very beginning, and I would like to say that we are very grateful to wonderful IT support team that we have, also from Lviv, the ones that work with Center for Urban History, the Cytogist company. And but I also wanted to share our experience with working with target audiences from the very beginning. So we have a very successful cooperation with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Switzerland. We've presented our materials there several times, and one of the suggestions that we got from them is to add another section to our website, and these are policy analysis reports and policy briefs. So they are also very interested in graphs and maps, but for them, for example, it's much better to have also like this short analysis of particular questions, and that's what we are going to do. And also in future we are planning to to create a Ukrainian version of this website. But first we want to finish one language version and then to translate it into another. So thank you very much for your attention, and I hope I didn't exhaust my time too much, and I'll be happy to answer your questions.
I think we'll have a lot of questions. Okay, let's collect 3. Okay. Second round.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This was really eye-opening, and I have a question that is selfish because it relates to me, but also to what you've done already, and probably also to some of the other presentations. So, as we compile data sets, a lot of the questions that I've been getting, and I'm sure all of you have been getting, is when are you going to make this public or available for everyone else to use in their own special way, which is one of the wonderful things about JS, for example, is you can just give them stuff and they can do whatever they want with it. So my question for you from your experience then is, how do you know when you're comfortable enough with the data that you've created that you're willing to share it with the rest of the world, you know, and that someone's not going to find that, you know, you've totally screwed something up, and that, you know, that you're willing to say, hey, look, this is good enough for anyone else to do whatever they want with. What's the process for that, and then how do you actually go about sharing the raw data for someone else to take and plug into what they're doing?
My question is a question from someone who is really not used to study Ukraine and is completely new here, and well, the question begins with an observation from your told and the previous one. You're systematically saying that Ukraine is something that is a construction that has a problem with the question of borders and inside borders, outside borders, and the recent conflict is also showing us that. And I find really interesting to see that you are always using Ukraine borders as a logo for your projects, both of you. And that's very interesting for me coming from outside and looking at your project as it was a kind of also a construction of an identity for the project, for the country, or what's your position about that? And my question is relating to this issue you have trying to describe a reality that is not always linked with the boundaries of the regions, or regions that are not regions, or that some want to see as regions and other not, or linguistic, religious, or something like that. You are always using administrative areas, and that's really a problem for the analyst, I would say. Why don't you use hexagons or squares from 10 kilometers, just to try to get rid from this administrative organization of the data you have? Maybe, but because it's something that completely relates to your questions, to try to get out of this preconceptualized scheme or way of organizing things.
And the third question from Eva.
Thank you very much, Anya, for also criticizing a bit the tool you use, and it's really very illuminating examples you showed. And my question is somehow related to the previous one, because still I have a feeling that very much this kind of project and many other sociological projects are so much focused on what we can call identity, and the issue of identity, regional identities, national identities, and other stuff. And of course, one of most pressing questions today, like the reasons of the conflict and the ways out of the conflict in the east of Ukraine. And do you think this tool you use in this project can generate some other questions going beyond question of identities, and what kind of questions can you put to your data to actually overcome this reduction of the whole, you know, circumstances of the conflict to the issue of regional differences and the issue of, you know, fixed identities and people having, you know, kind of a set of certain identifications actually determining the conduct. So can you imagine some other types of questions? Thank you.
Shall I answer? Okay, I'll try to, though it's some big questions for my shoulders, but I'll try to answer them as much as I can. So first of all, about being, when we are comfortable with sharing our data, I would split this question into two. So first, when we are comfortable with sharing our databases, and I think it's, well, usually the scholars are very protective of their databases, I would say. And something that I feel is unique about our project is precisely the fact that we want to come out of the ivory tower of our conferences and publications and to make it available for many people, both in Ukraine and abroad. So we made our two datasets, 13 and 15, available after a certain amount of publications were already issued, and the 2017 dataset will also be available a little bit later. However, when it comes to the platforms, the research platform like MAPA or like ours, it was a dilemma for us whether we should first, do everything like we want, like we imagine, and then present it as an end product, or we should rather address various audiences with this work in progress, trying also to incorporate different criticism and probably suggestions. So we've selected this second path. Even though the interviews are still not there, I think that we really benefit from interacting with our target audiences. The second question is about borders. I do understand what you mean, and yeah, we can look at this map. However, for me, so when we were selecting this kind of logo or first page, for me this kaleidoscopic nature was kind of appealing. So that's why we decided to put it online. I do understand the limitations of this approach, but also it's something recognizable. It's like a logo of a country.
Yeah, the question is not really about the logo itself.
Okay.
It was more a remark. Yeah.
Okay, I understand. So I'll come to the question of administrative areas a bit later. But it's also, we are part of a larger network that is Ukrainian research in Switzerland that is based in Basel University. So I think it's also a part of a collective endeavor to bring Ukraine on the map of academic studies in Europe. So you should also regard it in the context of the presence of Ukraine as not just part of Russian studies or Soviet studies, but also as an independent and interesting subject. As for administrative areas, well, first of all, don't get me wrong. I mean, these maps are not the only thing that we've produced. So, if you read the book that will soon be published, we also write about historical regions, like, for example, Galicia or Slobozhanщина, which of course don't necessarily correspond with contemporary borders, but also when it comes to sociological data, we are sample bounded, and the samples are very often designed according to administrative borders. So this is of course a limitation, but even if you have 6,000 respondents, you really, the sociological companies, they design the samples according to Lviv Oblast or Kyiv Oblast. Well, this is how it's done. So that's why it's also probably the simplest way to represent this data. As of the question of identities, I think this is a very broad issue in sociology in general. Let me just remind you that even though I presented the question of identity as a story map, this will be only one of the story maps that we plan to produce. And also, if we look, for example, again at the infographics, we do have one part that concerns identities, but also there are many other topics covered, and what precisely the story maps and the putting together the quantitative data and interviews is aimed at problematizing what we understand as identity and to give the voice to people and how they understand this question. And also, of course, even if you look on the question about identities itself, we have actually, I don't know, it's not here somehow, but probably there was some problem, some technical problem, I'm sorry. But actually the list of identities includes also non-territorial or non-national identities like female, male, family member, and these are actually the most popular identifications among Ukrainians, and you can also see it from our data. So this is only one of the questions that we ask in the context of broader research questions. So this is definitely not something we are too focused on.
More questions?
You shown a map about Holodomor, where we could see different regions where some people believe that it was genocide and some not. I have a question. Have you ever seen similar map about Holocaust?
Whether it was a genocide or not?
Yes.
So yeah, if you look, okay, so we actually had a question about most important events in the history of Ukraine, and here you have both Holodomor and Holocaust, and you can see that Holocaust is still emphasized as one of the important events in Ukrainian history. And also what is important that only 2.6% of respondents said that they know nothing about Holocaust, opposed to, for example, Volyn massacre, which a quarter of respondents have never heard of. Additionally, in 2013, we've asked a question to which extent different groups suffered during the World War II. From 1 did not suffer at all to 7 were victims of genocide. And interestingly, the most of respondents believe that actually Ukrainians were the biggest victims of war, and 70% believe that they were the victims of genocide. However, when it comes to Jews, 68% said that they believe that Jews were victims of genocide. However, also this number was quite high for example, for Russians or Belarusians. So this brings us to the question of scholarly understanding of certain concepts versus vernacular understanding. So apparently for our respondents, genocide is just an extreme way of suffering, and they do not necessarily understand it the way Lemkin understood or the way contemporary debates are held. So yes, we did include the question of Holocaust also in our part about historical memory, and yeah, this is exactly the estimated suffering of different groups in World War II. And also we had a different interesting question: to what extent in the course of history Ukrainians were victims of and Ukrainians acted as perpetrators towards. And we can see that Germans are seen as the biggest perpetrators, and generally, of course, everybody was a perpetrator and we practically did not harm anyone. I mean, this is a very well-known in-group bias that you can also encounter in other similar surveys. Yes, so when it comes to Jews, this number, so the question of collaboration, the question of the participation of Ukrainians in the Holocaust, we can see that it doesn't really play out, because on the scale between 1 and 5, it is only 2.04. So this is something that has not really been yet a part of public debates, and therefore is not really reflected in the results of our survey.
Yeah, I have 3 small concrete questions. Very often sociologists need to define categories in a way which don't really reflect the complexity of blurred realities. For example, my concrete question about language, you ask Ukrainian or Russian, but what about those kinds of languages which are sort of in between, what we call suzhik? Is that categorized as Ukrainian or Russian or as a third variant? Or that is, I think, quite that changes the map a lot. That is one question. Then you mentioned this interesting fact about Kherson and Odessa concerning what was it, Holodomor, I think?
Mm-hmm.
When such striking differences come up, do you also interpret them? Do you give like answers to them, or do they just remain as a result, as a statistical result? And the third question is about, you're talking about regions. What about the divide city countryside, which is again something which goes beyond regions, and the city is always different, city population is always different from rural environments. So is that also reflected?
Okay, so let's start with language question. First of all, if you look on the native language, we of course have the option both Ukrainian and Russian, where I think Surzhyk might partly fall into. However, there is always the option of other. So if the respondent wants, he or she can choose this option, and this also includes other languages besides Ukrainian and Russian. Again, these are precisely the in-depth interviews that keep us the complexity of language situation, and people reflect very much on the ways that they use different languages in their household or at work. So if you want to study this question in depth, it's really important not to use only statistical data, just like for any other complex questions. And we also asked about the attitudes to Surzhyk. So, for example, you can see here, and apparently majority of people say that they don't like it. However, of course, it's very widely used, but it also has some kind of a social stigma, I would say. As of the question about Kherson and Odessa, well, first of all, precisely the map just gives you this phenomenon, okay? This is something to be explored more deeply, and this is why you have statistical databases, and you can conduct, for example, correlation tests or regressions, so already more sophisticated methods of statistical analysis are needed to try to explain it or to give more volume to this phenomenon. The same goes for city versus countryside. Our statistical data allows us to compare it, for example, to single out city from an oblast, and this is done by particular researchers in our team. So, of course, not everything is on the website, and not everything can be conveyed visually, and I think the biggest part is, of course, in the text, and the aim of the website is to somehow lead to the texts and to read on the particular topics that the people are interested in, that our researchers have written about.
I have a similar question to Surzhyk. Maybe to try to conceptualize this difference between Ruski and Rossiyski.
Okay.
There is a difference, not everybody who considers himself or herself. Ruski is in supporting Russia or have Russian identity. The problem is in language, because in English there is just one word, Russian, which doesn't reflect the differences.
I think in Ukrainian the difference is also not so much reflected. But again, this is the question that is very difficult to grasp statistically, and that's where the interviews come handy. And I cannot tell you from my hand, but again, even on the small story map that is just at the beginning of its creation, you can see how differently people conceptualize what it means for them to be Russian. Is it more historical connections with Russia, or it's just because of their native language or their parents? And that's where you can find things like that and explanations like that.
Hi, I have a question as well. First of all, congratulations. It looks really good. I'm from another target user group than researchers, so from my user group perspective, congratulations on this. I have a question on the storyboards or story maps. You create and the quotes you use there. How do you choose those quotes, and do they represent the actual majority opinion or the minority opinion?
Again, this is a wider methodological question to qualitative data. I don't think it is designed to represent majority or minority. It is designed to represent the variety of opinions. So these are the quotes from the interviews that we've gathered as parts of different collections. For example, the interviews on religion, on historical memory, on language, and also the focus groups. And these are the quotes where people basically reflect on this question. And it's not to show that in this region majority thinks this way. It is to show that there is a whole spectrum of how this question can be understood.
But how you select this?
How we select this? We select this from what we have in our materials. So we have 600 interviews, and in Atlas TI we code them. And for example, if we see that there is a passage about Russian identity, we quote it as Russian identity or as Orthodox identity, I don't know, or as something else, depending on your focus. And then luckily the software gives you the possibility to export the data according to each particular code. And in this way, you have then a list of quotes that can be conveyed to Storyma.
May I also jump very briefly? If I got you correctly, one of the very, very basic conclusions, which would be in this book, Regionalism without regions, would be that actually we do not have this region except Galicia. So we are going back to this notion of two Ukraines, where we have Galicia and the rest. So somehow I'm wondering, project started as something which has to unpack the question of two Ukraines, and we are back to pretty similar conclusions. Maybe we have to unpack Galicia as well.
Yes, thank you for this critical comment. Well, first of all, it doesn't oppose Galicia to other Ukraine. It just claims that these three oblasts think alike, let's say. So the attitudes, the results are quite similar. So they are quite consistent in the attitudes to various questions in language, in religion, and many other, and economic patterns as well, for example. However, it means that when we take other regions, there is no such consistency observed. So it doesn't mean that Galicia is so much different from other Ukraine. Very often we see very similar results, for example, in Galicia, in Kharkiv Oblast, or in Cherkasy Oblast. But it just shows that apart from Galicia, there is no clear-cut, defined historical or cultural or contemporary region that acts it's the same way.
We have no more questions, so thank you, Anya, one more time for this wonderful presentation.